When I walked into that courtroom 5 years ago, I thought I was fighting for my son's future. I had no idea I was about to uncover a family secret that would change everything. My name is Sarah Martinez, and this is the story of how one woman's greed led to the most shocking revelation of my life. But when the billionaire defendant stood up and said 4 words that silenced the entire courtroom, "That's my grandson, Your Honor," everyone realized this wasn't just another custody case. This was about family, secrets, and justice, served in the most unexpected way. If you love stories about karma and justice, smash that like button now and subscribe for more incredible true stories that will leave you speechless. Let me take you back to where it all began. I was 34, working 2 jobs just to keep my head above water. My son Miguel was 8 years old then, the brightest light in my life, and honestly, the only reason I kept pushing forward every single day. We lived in a tiny 2-bedroom apartment above Mrs. Chen's bakery, and while it wasn't much, it was home. Miguel wasn't just smart, he was extraordinary. While other kids his age were struggling with basic addition, my boy was solving algebra problems for fun. His teachers kept telling me he needed to be in a special program, something that could challenge his brilliant mind. But there was one problem. We couldn't afford the private schools, and the public gifted program had a waiting list longer than my arm. Every night after my shift at the diner, I'd come home exhausted, my feet aching, and my uniform smelling like grease. But Miguel would be sitting at our little kitchen table, surrounded by library books, asking me questions about quantum physics or ancient history. Questions I couldn't answer. It broke my heart knowing that my financial situation was holding back his potential. I had dropped out of college when I found out I was pregnant. Miguel's father, well, let's just say he disappeared faster than morning mist when he heard the news. I never told Miguel much about his father, only that sometimes people aren't ready to be parents. I figured protecting his heart was more important than satisfying his curiosity. Then came the day that changed everything. I received a letter from the Riverside Elementary Gifted Program saying Miguel had been accepted. Then another letter 3 days later saying there had been a mistake. His spot had been given to another child whose family had made significant contributions to the school district. I couldn't sleep that night. I kept thinking about Miguel's face when I told him, the way his shoulders sagged, how he tried to smile and tell me it was okay. But it wasn't okay. It was far from okay. I started digging, asking questions, making phone calls. What I discovered made my blood boil. The gifted program had an unofficial policy. Children of major donors got priority placement, regardless of their test scores. It wasn't written down anywhere, but everyone knew how it worked. Pay to play, even in public education. The child who took Miguel's spot, her grandmother had donated $2 million to build the new science wing. Her test scores were good, but Miguel's were exceptional. This wasn't about merit anymore. It was about money. And I was about to find out just how deep this corruption went. I made a decision that night that would change everything. I was going to sue the school district. I couldn't afford a lawyer, so I'd represent myself. How hard could it be, right? I laugh now thinking about how naive I was. I spent every free moment in the public library, reading law books, learning about civil rights and educational discrimination. The librarian, Mrs. Patterson, started setting aside legal texts for me. She'd give me encouraging smiles and whisper, "You've got this, honey," whenever I looked ready to give up. The main defendant in my lawsuit was Victoria Blackstone, a billionaire who sat on the school board. Blackstone Industries owned half the businesses in our town. Her granddaughter, Emma, was the child who had taken Miguel's spot. Victoria was known for her charitable donations, but I was starting to see them for what they really were: investments in maintaining a system that benefited the wealthy. I'll never forget the first time I saw her picture in the newspaper. There was something familiar about her face, but I couldn't place it. She had perfectly styled silver hair, cold blue eyes, and the kind of confidence that comes from never being told no. I stared at that photo for a long time. trying to figure out why she looked familiar, but the memory stayed just out of reach. The day of the first hearing, I walked into that courthouse, wearing my best outfit, a black dress I'd bought from a thrift store, and shoes that pinched my feet but looked professional. I carried a briefcase I'd borrowed from my neighbor, filled with carefully organized documents and legal precedents I'd researched. On the other side sat a team of 5 lawyers in $1,000 suits, led by Jonathan Pierce, the most ruthless attorney in the state. They looked at me like I was a bug they were about to squash under their designer shoes. Judge Harrison seemed to have already made up his mind before I even opened my mouth. Every objection I made was overruled. Every piece of evidence I presented was dismissed on technicalities I didn't even understand. When I tried to argue that the donor preference policy was discriminatory, Pierce interrupted me with legal jargon that made my head spin. "Your Honor," Pierce said with a smirk, "Ms. Martinez's amateur understanding of educational law is touching, but this court's time would be better served addressing real legal matters, not the complaints of parents who simply cannot accept that their children aren't as special as they believe them to be." The words hit me like a physical blow. The courtroom erupted in whispers and barely contained laughter. I felt my cheeks burn with humiliation as Judge Harrison agreed to dismiss my case for failure to establish standing and frivolous litigation. But the worst was yet to come. As I gathered my papers with shaking hands, Pierce approached me. "Ms. Martinez," he said loud enough for everyone to hear, "perhaps you should focus on teaching your son realistic expectations rather than wasting the court's valuable time." That's when Judge Harrison threatened to hold me in contempt for disrupting the proceedings, simply because I tried to defend my son. I was literally escorted out of the courtroom by the bailiff, my dreams of justice crumbling with every step. What I didn't know was that someone had been watching the entire humiliating spectacle from the back of the courtroom. Marcus Blackstone sat quietly in the gallery, his jaw tightening with each dismissive comment from the judge and lawyers. Marcus was Victoria's estranged son, though I wouldn't learn this until much later. 15 years earlier, he had walked away from the family business and the Blackstone fortune over what he called irreconcilable differences in ethics. He'd built his own tech company from the ground up and now funded educational initiatives for underprivileged children. That day, watching me fight for Miguel, something stirred in Marcus that he hadn't felt in years. He saw something familiar in my determination, something that reminded him of why he'd left his family's empire in the first place. He decided to investigate the school district's practices, starting with the case of Sarah Martinez and her son. What Marcus uncovered was a web of corruption that went far deeper than simple donor preferences. Victoria had been systematically manipulating educational opportunities for years, ensuring that wealthy families maintained their advantages while deserving children like Miguel were pushed aside. The weeks following my courtroom humiliation were the darkest of my life. Victoria's lawyers sent threatening letters, warning me about continued harassment of their client. My boss at the diner, Tony, called me into his office with a grim expression. "Sarah, I've got to let you go," he said, unable to meet my eyes. "Mrs. Blackstone owns the building. She made it clear that employing you would be problematic for my lease renewal." I felt like the walls were closing in. Without that job, I couldn't pay rent. Miguel would ask me every day when he could start the special classes, and I'd have to smile and tell him, "Soon, baby, soon," while my heart was breaking. But then something happened that gave me hope. Mrs. Patterson, the librarian, pulled me aside one afternoon. "Sarah, I've been thinking about your case. You might want to look through some old yearbooks. Sometimes the past holds keys to the present." I didn't understand what she meant then, but I spent hours going through dusty yearbooks from local colleges. And then I found something that made my blood run cold. A photo from 15 years ago, from the college I had briefly attended. There, smiling in a sorority picture, was a young woman named Victoria Blake. Victoria Blake, not Victoria Blackstone. Blake was her maiden name. And suddenly I remembered. Vicky Blake had been my roommate during my freshman year of college. The same Vicky who had been there when I found out I was pregnant. The same Vicky who had promised to help me figure things out and then disappeared without a word after graduation. But the real shock came when I looked more carefully at the photo. Standing next to Vicky Blake, with his arm around another girl, was a young man whose face I recognized from a photo Miguel kept by his bed. A photo I'd given him years ago of his father, James Blackstone, Victoria's son, Miguel's father. The pieces fell into place, like dominoes. James Blackstone had died in a car accident when Miguel was just a baby. He never knew he had a son, because Victoria had made sure of that. When James told his mother he'd gotten a girl pregnant, Victoria had hired investigators to find me. She'd been watching Miguel and me from afar for 8 years. This wasn't a random case of educational discrimination. This was personal. Victoria knew exactly who Miguel was, her grandson, her own blood, and she had been systematically denying him opportunities while giving them to her other granddaughter, Emma. The cruelty of it took my breath away. She had let me struggle, let me work 2 jobs, let me beg and plead for my son's education, all while knowing she was his grandmother. She could have stepped in at any time, could have helped, could have given Miguel the life his father would have wanted for him. But there was something else I discovered that changed everything. In going through James's effects, which Victoria had kept locked away, Marcus found something that would expose the biggest twist of all. Marcus brought me a letter he'd found in his brother's things. A letter James had written, but never sent. In it, James wrote about how much he loved me and how he planned to propose. He wrote about wanting to be a father to our child and how he was saving money to help me finish college. But here's the twist that nobody saw coming. James had discovered that Victoria was paying my college roommate, the original Vicky Blake, to spy on me and report back about my pregnancy. When James confronted his mother about this betrayal, he threatened to cut ties with the family entirely unless she stopped interfering in his life. The car accident that killed James wasn't random. According to the letter, Victoria had called him that night, claiming there was a family emergency that required his immediate return home. The roads were icy, visibility was poor, but Victoria insisted it couldn't wait until morning. James died racing home to deal with a crisis that Victoria later admitted was nothing more than wanting to discuss his inappropriate relationship with me. In other words, Victoria's manipulation and control had indirectly led to her own son's death. The guilt and anger she carried had twisted into a bitter resentment toward me and Miguel, living reminders of what her controlling nature had cost her. Armed with this explosive information, I returned to court. But this time I wasn't alone. Marcus Blackstone stood beside me as my unexpected ally and witness. The courtroom was packed with reporters, families who had been affected by the corrupt donor system, and curious onlookers who had heard about the David and Goliath battle. When Victoria saw her son walking into the courtroom with me, her face went completely white. She whispered something urgently to her lawyers, but Pierce looked just as shocked as she did. "Your Honor," I began, my voice steady despite the enormity of the moment. "This case is about more than educational discrimination. It's about a grandmother who has spent 8 years denying opportunities to her own grandson out of spite and guilt." The courtroom erupted in gasps and murmurs. Judge Harrison, a different judge this time, called for order and allowed me to continue. I presented the DNA evidence, the photographs, James's letter, and testimonies from other families who had been cheated by the system. Marcus testified about his mother's history of using money and influence to manipulate outcomes, not just in education, but in business and politics. But the moment that will stay with me forever was when Victoria finally spoke. Standing up slowly, her hands shaking, she looked directly at Miguel for the first time. "That's my grandson, Your Honor," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "That beautiful, brilliant boy is my James's son." and I've been punishing him for my own guilt." The silence in that courtroom was deafening. You could have heard a pin drop. The aftermath was swift and brutal for Victoria Blackstone. Criminal investigations were launched into her financial dealings and influence peddling. The donor preference policy was ruled illegal, and dozens of families came forward with their own stories of corruption and discrimination. Victoria lost her position on the school board, faced criminal charges for fraud and conspiracy, and watched as her carefully constructed empire began to crumble. But perhaps the greatest punishment was realizing what her pride and guilt had cost her. 8 years of watching her grandson grow up from a distance. 8 years of denying him the love and opportunities she could have provided. Pierce and his team abandoned her faster than rats fleeing a sinking ship, leaving her to face the consequences of her actions with an overworked public defender. Miguel, meanwhile, was immediately admitted to the gifted program, where he thrived beyond everyone's expectations. Marcus set up an education fund that would ensure Miguel never lacked for opportunities again. He also offered me a position with his educational foundation, working to identify and help other children who were being held back by systemic inequality. The relationship between Victoria and Miguel developed slowly and carefully. She was facing prison time, but the judge allowed supervised visits while she awaited sentencing. I watched as this proud, cold woman gradually softened in the presence of her grandson. Miguel, with the wisdom that sometimes surprises me in children, seemed to understand that his grandmother was deeply sad and needed kindness more than anger. Their first conversation was stilted and awkward, but by their third visit, I saw Victoria smile, really smile, for the first time. She told Miguel stories about his father, showed him pictures and mementos she had kept hidden for years. She taught him to play chess, the same way she had taught James. And slowly, painfully, she began to heal from the guilt that had poisoned her heart for so long. Victoria ultimately served 2 years in minimum security prison. But during that time, she used her connections and remaining resources to establish educational grants for underprivileged children. It was her way of making amends, not just to Miguel and me, but to all the families her selfishness had hurt. Today, Miguel is 13 and thriving in an advanced academic program. He's already taking college-level courses in mathematics and science, and universities are beginning to take notice. But more importantly, he's happy. He has a grandmother who adores him, an uncle who mentors him, and a mother who fought the world to give him the future he deserved. Victoria and I will never be friends. Too much has happened for that. But we've found a way to coexist peacefully for Miguel's sake. She's learned to respect boundaries, and I've learned that sometimes people do terrible things for reasons that make sense to them, even when those reasons are completely wrong. The most beautiful part of this whole story is watching Miguel with his grandmother. He sees past her mistakes to the lonely, grieving woman underneath. He's teaching her about forgiveness in ways I never could, and she's giving him the family history and connection he never had. Marcus has become like the brother I never had. His foundation has helped hundreds of children access educational opportunities they otherwise would have been denied. We work together now, identifying systemic inequalities and fighting to change them through both legal channels and direct action. Sometimes the people who try to keep us down are the very ones connected to our destiny in ways we never imagined. Victoria Blackstone tried to destroy my son's future because she couldn't face her own past. But in the end, her actions led to Miguel discovering a family he never knew existed and opportunities beyond his wildest dreams. I learned that karma isn't always immediate, and it doesn't always look like punishment. Sometimes karma looks like healing, like redemption, like broken people finding their way back to love. Victoria lost her empire, but gained her grandson. I fought for my son's education and ended up giving him a family. The real victory wasn't defeating Victoria in court. It was watching her become the grandmother Miguel deserved to have all along. If this story moved you, smash that like button and hit subscribe for more incredible true stories about karma, justice, and the power of never giving up. What would you do if you discovered your biggest enemy was actually family? Tell us in the comments below, and don't forget to ring that notification bell. You won't want to miss our next shocking story about how one act of kindness revealed a truth that changed two families forever.